Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see all of you tonight, and welcome to tonight's third LA conversation between Mayor Eric Garcetti and Los Angeles Times architectural critic and Oxy professor Christopher Hawthorne. I'm delighted that you could join us. This is Third LA's third year, and the popularity of the series has revealed a hunger for this kind of thoughtful and incisive conversation about the city, where it's headed, and what it means for all of us. Los Angeles is in the midst of reinventing itself in some fundamental and some controversial post-suburban ways. These are issues that were at the heart of this month's election, and they are the same issues we will be exploring tonight. As you know, Mayor Garcetti won a second term as mayor, and we want to congratulate him. With a record-breaking 81% of the vote. He is the only person I know who is a mayor and has played a mayor on TV shows such as The Closer and Major Crimes. As this is Los Angeles, I'm not entirely sure which was more impressive to your voters. What is impressive is Mayor Garcetti's record after just one term. He has led Los Angeles to raise its minimum wage, lower its business tax, and pass an ambitious transportation plan and major initiative to house the homeless. We are proud that he is often called on Occidental to help him carry out his agenda. Just two examples. Brenda Shockley, class of '68, is his new deputy mayor for economic development, and Rick Cole, class of '78, was Mayor Garcetti's deputy mayor for budget and innovation. We are also lucky to have a mayor who combines the improvisational skills of a jazz pianist, the leadership skills of a Naval Reserve officer, and the intellectual curiosity of a Rhodes Scholar, all of which he was and is. Mayor Garcetti is no stranger to Occidental. He spent 2 years teaching in the Department of World Affairs from 1999 to 2000. This is his second Third LA conversation with Christopher here at Occidental, and we want to welcome him. Christopher Hawthorne, the distinguished architectural critic of the Los Angeles Times, is also no stranger to Occidental. He has taught at Occidental as a professor for the past several years. The Third LA series is an outgrowth of his Occidental classes and a book project. The title of architectural critic does not really capture Christopher's brief, which includes civic architecture, urban planning, and the design of public and green spaces in Los Angeles and elsewhere. He is the author of the Greenhouse, New Directions in Sustainable Architecture, and over the past few months he has written in the Times about such disparate subjects as Frank Gehry's new Berlin Concert Hall, the production design of the Academy Awards, and the relationship between airport design and protest. As a critic and teacher, Christopher not only looks at individual buildings, but the urban fabric as a whole. And as such, he is a critic for our times. That's the subject of tonight's conversation, the civic landscape of Los Angeles at a crucial juncture in the city's history. We're in for a very, very good evening. Welcome to you both.
Welcome, everyone. Is this microphone working? Can everybody hear in the back? Terrific. Nice to see all of you. I think we've set a new record for attendance for Third LA events tonight. We had close to 1,000 registered, and I think it breaks the earlier mark, which was set when we had a debate in this room about the future of the LA County Museum of Art with Michael Govan and others. And we were talking a little bit backstage, the mayor and I, about the fact that this is actually the third time that we've been able to sit down and talk about these issues. The second time here at Oxy, as President Verge mentioned, beginning with a conversation when you were a candidate. The AIA sponsored a series of conversations with mayoral candidates back in 2013. And then in 2014, not long after you began, we had a chance to sit down at Keck, another theater on campus, and talk about some of these issues. So it's a real pleasure to have you back. Thank you for your willingness to continue this conversation. I think it's really rare and important that we have a mayor who's conversant in these issues, thoughtful about them, interested in having a public conversation at a moment, as we'll discuss tonight, when Los Angeles is really undergoing a significant transformation. Let me give a very quick plug for next week. We really thought of this conversation as the first part of a two-part conversation on mayoral leadership in LA County. So back on campus next Wednesday evening, March 29th, in Choi Auditorium in Johnson Hall, which is where we have most of our Third LA events on campus. We will be having a conversation with the young, dynamic mayors of Compton and Long Beach, Asia Brown of Compton and Robert Garcia of Long Beach, both of whom are in their 30s, talking about looking ahead to the next generation of leadership. And I think it will overlap in some significant ways with the conversation we have tonight. It's two cities that the LA River runs through, for example, cities that the Blue Line runs through, thinking about transit, thinking about the future of the LA River. So please join us for that if you're interested. That's in a much smaller hall, and it's likely to fill up pretty quickly. So please put your name on the registration list. Just oxy.edu/3LA will get you to the sign up for those events. So I wanted to start with a question. We will certainly be looking ahead. We'll be talking about your second term and your plans for that term as they relate to the subjects that this series is concerned with: the built environment, urban design, architecture, public space, of course. But since we're revisiting a conversation that began in 2013 and continued in 2014 when you were just starting as the mayor, I want to ask you about what you learned from the first term, not in a broad sense, but in a structural sense, about how you could really achieve your agenda. This is a city that's known for having a relatively weak position of mayor vis-a-vis the city council in particular. And in terms of the issues I write about, planning and development in particular, a lot of power is located in each council office and the planning deputy in each council office. So in terms not just of articulating an agenda, but actually realizing it, what are the lessons that you take from that first term that you think you can apply to the second one?
Well, first of all, let me say how great it is to be back at Occidental, and to thank everybody for coming out here tonight. This is amazing to be back here. It's a campus that I love and that I spent some really amazing years at. And it's funny, when I was a professor here, my wife, Amy Lane Wakeland, worked with Professor Dreyer and some others on something called the Progressive Los Angeles Network. My chief of staff, Ana Guerrero, who's here tonight, also worked on that. And it laid out for the people running in 2001 what a progressive agenda for Los Angeles would look like. And it's funny to be here now, having gone through the debates in the next incarnation, now actually being a mayor for almost 4 years, and to look back at how formative that was. I actually pulled out the agenda of Progressive Los Angeles Network, which was probably, I don't know, a 160-point plan for Los Angeles, as only progressives can do, right? We had an answer for everything. And really to see how this city has gathered around so much of it, and yet how some of the work that we're doing today and still pushing for right now in the city council, for instance, literally are in some of those policy papers from 2000 and 2001. But the lessons that I've learned, I think they've been twofold. One is, I hate this cliche, this caricature of politics, that sometimes people, let's just say hypothetically, people who've been in business their whole life who decide to run for office for the first time, that they think that what we do is different than becoming a professor, an electrician, an actor, somebody who is a police officer, that it's really more about judgment than skill. That, if you've succeeded in a certain area, and I understand that's part of the culture of the country, we're all supposed to be kind of citizen farmers and participate in legislatures, that we're supposed to be temporary and then go back to tilling the land. We set it up that way, but I would argue that what I do is as specialized, if not even more complicated and specialized than many other professions. And so you can't just come in and suddenly pretend to lead without knowing the balance of powers, at the national level, that there's a judiciary and a bureaucracy and things that matter. And we're seeing, our current president kind of run into that this is a shared system. Los Angeles City Hall actually reflects a lot that national system. And I think you're right on a lot of land use stuff, but I think it's overplayed that Los Angeles City is a weak mayor system. It's actually not. It's stronger than Chicago's charter, for instance. There's a lot of formal power. I can appoint and get rid of, not trying to say anything to Vince Bertoni, our excellent planning director who's here tonight, any of the general managers of the 37 departments, with the exception of police chief, but you basically can through the police commission. So that is kind of how the city runs. So laying out the vision and the big projects really rest with the mayor's office. But I think the biggest lesson I've learned and what I've started changing over this last year is it wasn't enough I was a very respectful mayor since I came from the city council. And I do believe that there's a good reason why the council members are strong and the council members defer to neighborhood councils and so on and so forth. Because somebody who lives on a block knows better than the person who's the person in charge, the activist in the neighborhood. The neighborhood activist knows better than probably the council deputy. The council deputy might know better than the council member. The council member knows better than the mayor. But it wasn't a good enough answer, and it was kind of a little incomplete as I saw the design of projects sometimes come through that were very unsatisfying to me, or the scale. And so now, at least on larger projects, I'm getting personally briefed on them to kind of make up for what I've learned to be a better mayor, to recognize that I had 12 years of experience as a council member. I want to apply that. I have an interest in design. And I've seen these moments happen. I'll answer the question with this. When we built all the new schools for the LAUSD system, it was the equivalent of taking San Diego's school district and plopping it down in LA. It was the largest such program. Voters were very generous, 2-3 bonds to pass this. And we got a bunch of Navy guys in, go Navy, but it was a bunch of admirals and captains who did it very efficiently. But if you look at the design of all the schools at that moment, with very few exceptions, they have no context. They don't interact with the streets and the architecture of the neighborhoods. They're fortresses. They said, well, we have to do this for student safety. Well, there are middle schools that have grassy entrances that, welcome you like an old school with arms wrapping around that don't feel any less safe. But for whatever reason, some of these design concepts of utility really led to these islands. And so, of course, we treat schools like islands. We don't embrace them. Nobody wants to spend time at them afterwards because of that design. And I want to change that. So whether it's the big things like the LA River or the potential of cat parks over our freeways, looking at how we're going to be doing the transportation infrastructure, I also have learned, I think, not just to be macro. It's funny because most people have talked about me as a mayor who's more focused on the micro. From a design sense, I've been more focused on the macro. And I'm kind of learning you got to return to the micro as well, because you can't always trust that every single project is just going to turn out well. It might from an envelope or a community negotiation standpoint, but 20 years from now, which is kind of my measure, do I want to be driving by that project?
Right. I'm glad to hear you mention the LAUSD campaign, because that was happening when I started as architecture critic at the Times, and I had the same impression. It was really a program that was about efficiency and not about architecture, and a real missed opportunity, given I think the really important impact that the architecture of schools, the kind of message that a well-designed school can send to a kid, even as young as a kindergartner, about his place in the culture and the value that that culture puts on his education. And I think the library building campaign was a much better model, produced a lot better architecture, and I think we can talk a little bit later about how you start to build those construction campaigns that look more like the library model, which was both ambitious architecturally but also very connected to neighborhood and reflective of
you look at the Silver Lake Library. I always tell people, I lived in Silver Lake for a number of years, my wife and I, and in Echo Park, and if folks who know the area, but where Silver Lake T-bones into Glendale Boulevard, that was a pretty dead intersection when we first moved there, what time I was teaching here at Occidental. And when I was council member, it was literally, I use this as a good urban planning thing, one wine store, and because there had been bars and fights and things, people kind of opposed, a few people, the idea of anything alcohol. But a wine store, Vietnamese restaurant, a well-designed library, and a little higher density multifamily housing development, together with a block away a new park that we put along the reservoir with a walk path, which was also quite controversial. People were like, those folks are going to come to our neighborhood, but what's called the Meadow now, if you've ever been out there, transformed an entire neighborhood. I mean, it was a classic kind of urban acupuncture moment of a little bit from the private sector, a little bit from the public sector, but the good design of that library, it's really the hub of it all, and it evokes the same kind of, what I told them is I wanted something Neutra-esque because Neutra Place is 2 blocks away with a great concentration of these great homes that changed architecture.
So because of LA shifting elections from early and odd years to November of even years, your second term will stretch 5.5 years, which will be almost a decade, which in an era of term limits for mayors is a significant extra amount of time. And it happens, as I wrote a couple of weeks ago, at a moment when Los Angeles is negotiating this transition. You mentioned, we were talking backstage that we were looking at the tagline for this year's Conversations, Third LA Conversations of City on the Verge, and you were saying that it's always a city on the verge, but maybe even more so now. And I think that's true. You described it early in your tenure as mayor as a hinge moment in the city's transition, and that's been a phrase that's stuck in my mind. So given that you have a little extra time, given that you're looking at some big ticket pieces, that makes this a really potential for 5.5 years that could accomplish a lot. Now, the question, of course, on everyone's mind, I think, given that, is the degree to which you're looking at other offices, and without asking you to make a pledge like one of your opponents did, I think people are curious, as you sit here now, what's your degree of interest in the two races that will be happening next year, governor and senator? And what can you tell us about how you're seeing that vis-a-vis staying for the full 5.5 years of that second term?
I'm spending almost all my time thinking about the future of Los Angeles right now. I mean, genuinely, when politicians say things, that you think there's some sort of they're being coy and there's some secret plan. I don't have that, and I don't plan life too far ahead. Both because I think you have to respond to a moment. I mean, God, if we knew what was going to happen in November for some of us, I don't want to assume everybody's politics in here, but for some of us, maybe we would all run for president in here. I mean, you have to be flexible enough, I think, to answer the call of any moment, but I'm not answering a personal call of ambition, and I really like this job, and I really love this city, and I'm really focused on planning not just for the next 5.5 years, but for the next decade or 2 or 3. Because I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to live here. This is my home. This is the town I love. And I'm raising a 5-year-old daughter here, and I kind of look at what my work is through her eyes. What will it be like for her when she's your age and my age and somebody else's age out here? Those moments in our life when we're young people exploring the world for the first time, when we're kind of starting our families, and then when we're retired here and enjoying life. And I mean, first of all, specifically to those things, Senator Feinstein is running, and it's in some ways, even though she shows that you can be in your 80s and still be at the peak of your job. I mean, the torture report she put out, I thought was incredible, and the things that, much of the work that she's done, some of the most complicated legislation. So that's not even something I have to think about because she's running.
Do you think she'll face a serious primary challenge? I mean,
I don't think so. I mean, I think she'll maybe face a challenge. I know there were some people, for instance, who came out from kind of progressive groups to a fundraiser she was at recently, and were kind of protesting that she had voted for a couple cabinet officials, and she actually went out. One of the things I love about Dianne Feinstein, she's pretty fearless, and she went out into the street and took a microphone to the town hall. And one young activist said, "Take a stand." She said, "Young man, I've taken more stands than years you've been alive." I mean, she's got spunk. She's got, not always agree on all of the politics. She's been more centrist on certain things than I am. But she really delivers, and seniority matters, and I think we need some voices that are smart about how we move forward. The state is an interesting entity because I love the city as a platform. I think it's the most direct. You get to live in the place that you're improving, or not, or not improving. So you suffer through the same things. Contrary to popular belief, I don't float through traffic. I'm stuck in it with you, and I go over a pothole if I haven't paved it myself. But a great park that I'm able to open up, like the Meadow, is a place that I'm playing with my daughter. So there's something very fulfilling about it for me as a public servant to be in that same space and place, to see where you screw up and try to make it better, and to see where we've succeeded collectively. And the last part of answering the question is, what I'm excited about is I spent a lot of my political capital the first term building up a different way of relating to each other, across city lines with 88 other cities and the region, across political lines. The city council mayor gets along better, I think, than any ever have. With a board of supervisors and mayor who they used to always hate each other, and now we actually get along. And then I spent that capital on Measure M, Measure HHH, and Measure H. Obviously in defense of Measure S2 to try to forestall that and defeat that, but in homelessness and transportation, took 3 years and traveled the county and raised the money, and yet the next day when you pass HHH or H, there's no one less person in a tent. I don't know about you, but Measure M passed and I was still stuck in traffic the next day. So the fun part is actually implementing it. I'm not into like, hey, I passed it, good luck to my successor, go for it. I really want to see, how do we speed up 40 years of building 15 transit lines and maybe do it in 20? So some of us aren't dead when the last ones are opening. What do we do? What do we do to manage now? Because there's going to be more money than we've ever had to address homelessness. It might not be enough, but it'll be close to enough, I think, to end street homelessness and chronic homelessness. But do we have the capacity? Can we manage this with a kind of urgency and war room mentality that the way we took on crime 2 decades ago and got more scientific about it and looked, we're putting cops on dots? Can we do that so that we get to know the specific names of people in the specific tents in the specific neighborhoods with the same social workers working with them? Because I go out with those teams, that are doing that outreach, and I try to personalize it. I'm like, I'm your mayor. I'm not just the mayor for the rest of the people that you think I'm mayor. I'm your mayor, and you need to take today as the decision to get off the street. You need to trust me, and we're going to be there to catch you. And I've successfully coaxed some people off, but everybody on the street is traumatized, and they need to reestablish some trust. So, long answer to the question, but I think bottom line is I'm so excited and focused on this work that there's not much else I'm thinking about right now.
I think for those of us who think about these issues, planning the future of the city in terms of urban design, that extra year and a half is absolutely crucial. If you think about the mayor the American mayor who's had the biggest impact on the physical shape of his city, it's Michael Bloomberg in New York, who had 3 terms, and he earned that 3rd term through maybe
he paid good money
a little
for
bit
it
of
too.
Yeah, exactly, a little bit of creative electoral strategy, and but you have, in a way, a kind of nice middle ground, not having to push for changing the term limits, having to push for a 3rd term, but to have that little extra time to really see some of these larger projects, particularly around transit, it seems to me, in the river, and we'll talk about both of those, see them come into flower a little bit more. You mentioned Measure S. I'm very curious about your thoughts about the results and really its resounding defeat, but I want to ask you first, what's your sense about what gave rise to that measure? Certainly there's we can debate how well written the measure was and what accounted for that electoral defeat, but from your point of view, what is the specific frustration that's giving rise to that ballot measure in the first place? And we'll talk about where we go from here.
I think there's 2 things. One is not new. It's not like something new that's arisen. It's the history of Los Angeles. Land use is a full contact sport. It has come in popular referendum time and time again. Some of them pass, some of them don't. There's a feeling and change is difficult, and change is messy, and growth some people embrace and want, and some people want to somehow build a legislative wall around and prevent. I'm kind of agnostic about growth and density. I've had difficulty communicating this and being understood, so I'll try to give it to a 1500th time. I'm not inherently a pro-density or anti-density person. I'm a pro-planning person. I believe that people come here or have children here who already live here because they're free to do so. And so our challenge is to how we respond to the number of people that are here. Not that I've never believed that you build a condominium building and people in Wichita or people in Warsaw are like, time to move to LA. They built that building. They come here for other reasons. And so we've had decades where we haven't prepared for that and we haven't built much, and we've had decades where we do accommodate that and we do build it. And so I think part of it is just as a city grows, but its population, maybe it's not growing as much as we thought, but it's still growing. And we certainly saw a lot of jobs come back here, which is a great part of our recovery, but it comes with the concomitant problems of a housing crisis because you can't build housing quickly enough to accommodate all the jobs, and that pushes people out and that displaces them. I think it was a combination of everything from the most NIMBY instincts, where people are like, don't build anything, to the most kind of social justice oriented people who are like, wait, this isn't really this growth isn't working for everybody. But I think collectively, I was surprised by what a smaller minority it was. It's still sizable, and I don't dismiss it. I think one of the things I learned from my predecessor, Jackie Goldberg, when she was talking about how you get an affordable housing project done, is you can't dismiss people's fears. You can't say, oh, you're a racist, or you're an idiot, or you don't know. Like, it comes from a real place, and it's as genuine as your own perspective. You have to work through it and understand it, and then propose a reason maybe why that solution isn't the right solution. And I said, so that's one current of it, kind of just the history of what we have. The second current is that we just haven't updated our planning in a long, long time. It is our fault. It is City Hall. They were right. And Measure S didn't bring my attention to this. This is something I felt very strongly as a council member. But what would you do as a city leader when the recession comes? Do you lay off police officers and firefighters, or do you slow down your planning? It's always the last thing, even though it's the most necessary thing, because it's not the most urgent thing. And there's less of an immediate consequence to not doing it than suddenly somebody not having any sidewalk paved or a 911 call not getting answered. So during the recession, it got pushed off, even though we had a plan in place finally to update our blueprints for our neighborhoods called the community plans. My first year as mayor, I think we talked about this last time I was here, I doubled the community planning unit at our planning department to update those community plans. And people kind of say, well, why is it going to take so long? 10 years to update community plans? Until you participate in the update of one. In Hollywood, where when I was a council member, we did it, and we want to do it right, we had 114 public meetings. And the 114th public meeting, some people showed up and said, wait a second, I didn't hear about this. You're going to do what? I demand another meeting. So, you want to do very comprehensive, and this is a big issue I was going to actually bring up tonight in general for planning our future, is how do you, I think I wrote down the car, how do you get the balance between speed and kind of community input? Because things are changing so quickly in this world, we have to respond. If we don't respond quickly, they will overtake us. But if we respond too quickly, people will say, I wasn't included and I don't like the outcome. And I guarantee you, no matter how well we do things, there will be some outcomes that we all collectively don't like. We're not going to be perfect. So I have to err, Vince, his team have to err on the side of how can we do this the most quickly and the most responsibly. And so whether it's updating a zoning code that really hadn't been updated since it started in the 1940s, which is something we're doing called Recode LA. We're in the 4th of 5 years of doing this. And there's a lot of detail to that I could go into. Or whether it's the update of those community plans, which now we've pledged 6 to 7 years to do, which is hugely ambitious. 10 was super ambitious. And I even said, what if we hired every retired planner and every planning student coming out of all of our planning schools? What's the quickest we could do it? And we think there's 35 of them. Do 35 times those 100 meetings, and you get to see what a huge undertaking this is. But I think that's what Measure S kind of bubbled out of. But as I said the day after, it's not like we're going to go, yay, we won 70-30. It's, hey, I want to sit down with everybody here, talk to you, and find a common ground. Now, make no mistake, some people who were interested in the yes on S side think that they can stop density from happening. It was really interesting when you looked at the vote. You might not know all the numbers of the council districts, but the council district that voted the most against Measure S was Council District 5, where Paul Koretz is the council member, which is where all the stuff was written about, like these are the communities under siege, these are the neighbors who are like overwhelmed with development, and where there is more development activity.
Right.
Where the
More
highest vote
congestion, too.
for
Yeah.
S happened, even though it was still a handy win, it was in Council Districts 12, 3, and 7, which are kind of the west and northern rim of the San Fernando Valley, where there's the least activity. So it's interesting, those who have less density and development feared it a little bit more, and those that had it more actually said this is not the right answer. We maybe want to build our way forward.
Not so different from the immigration maps if you look at attitudes about immigration in the United States and how close people live to the border. In terms of planning reform, though, the people I know who understand the planning process best are the most pessimistic about the possibilities for planning reform. We did an event the week before Measure S, the first Third LA event of this year, on Measure S down in the Arts District, and Gail Goldberg, the former planning director, was quite candid, I have to say, and quite pessimistic about the prospects for planning reform. And she articulated a certain kind of cynicism, which I sometimes feel myself. That is to say, that if we all agree that the status quo is broken, that I think there's potentially a case to be made that there's a system in place for maintaining that status quo for the people it benefits on all sides of the issue. And I actually would put some growth opponents in that mix as well, that homeowners who don't want to see a lot of housing and development happen, like the status quo the way it is, because we've underproduced housing for 3 decades now. There's a certain number of developers who know how to work the system. The planning deputies of those council members I mentioned also have a kind of unique knowledge that becomes less powerful, less valuable if we have a more transparent system. And you saw up close what happened in Hollywood when that community plan wound up in court and wound up being thrown out by a judge. So how do you get past that, the way that the kind of obstacles and the way that people can gum up the works is sort of baked into the system to a certain degree, at least if we're thinking more cynically.
So I'm not a rosy, or rose glass covered, whatever the metaphor is, optimist, but I am absolutely an optimist. And I'm also a storyteller and a realist about, now I'm the old man at City Hall. I have 16 years of serving, which I think is longer than any other of the elected officials that are there. That's not my reality. And, you know, it was my first year on the city council. I was sitting next to Ruth Galanter, G-A-L, G-A-R, we sit alphabetically. And there was somebody who came up with that same theory. And that theory, I think, does have resonance. Many people do believe it. Where somebody came up and said, hey, I opposed this project, but I know you guys are all bought and paid for by the developers. They give you donations, blah, 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 and it's done, it's all worked out. And usually by the time something gets to council, it is worked out and the votes are all there. Not for a cynical reason, but because hopefully we're not deciding at the 11th hour. We've actually studied and done the work, and there's a consensus about it. But she turns to me in the way that only Ruth Galanter could say, and she said, you know, Eric, the only problem with the conspiracy theory is none of us are smart enough to pull it off. And that has always stuck with me. There's too many people who have to do too many things right with nobody ever finding out for this to be actually the way business is done.
I don't even mean corruption, though. I don't mean a conspiracy
But I'll go
theory.
for the next one, which is kind of who does this benefit, which you brought up. I actually asked all the council members, besides a couple of them, during this kind of S stuff and the updating of community plans, do you like having this discretionary power? Because that's the theory out there. Do you personally enjoy it? I'll give you my answer. I did 12 years of it. And do you think somehow if zoning was more straightforward and you could only do a 10-story building there, it's 10, and you can never do 11, and here it's 2, and you can never do more, that you would lose something? And to a T, they said, no, we hate it. And I hated it. I like talking about design. I like being able to make sure that there's pedestrian access. I like talking about what trees you're planting. And guess what? Even when it's by right, those people come and talk to you. You don't lose the power to do it. Right. And I just think it's a myth at City Hall that somehow like we love this power where that you come, kiss the ring, and now I'll decide what this should look like, and forget this community, and you tell me, and please make sure you show up at my next fundraiser. It just, I'm not saying that some people don't have some shades of that. I'm not like that naive. Right. But I also don't think that it's broken. I think it needs to be fixed.
Why haven't we updated the plans in so long? Why have we been
For the reason I said, so the recession, I don't know what happened before. Gail herself was the person who, and I love Gail Goldberg, she's an amazing friend and great planner. She was the one who put that plan forward. But it then ran to a hacksaw called the recession. Yeah. I don't know what happened before I got there. I think in some weird way, the system works even without it. It needs to work even better, be more transparent and more predictable so that people don't have those feelings as often. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that, you know, the bad planning we have mostly isn't the result of people getting variances or exceptions. It's bad architecture. It's the schools conversation we just had. Like, if we just had built the schools better, that would have had so much more of an imprint than, you know, somebody who disagreed with the variance where there are 2 stories more. There are some exceptions to that, like that I do have the shared concern of the mansionization, the mega mansions, and we have now moved that legislation forward. That does kind of destroy the feel of certain streets where it's single-story homes, and then boom, like, you know, 13 columns and 14 stories, like right next door, that gobbles up every piece of land. But I don't think it's so much that it's broken. I think it just needs to get better and more transparent, and it's too painful to get to what more often than not is a good outcome. But that doesn't mean it's well designed, the look, but it's a good outcome for the scale. I think we've actually grown as a city pretty reasonably and responsibly.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of reading, understanding the results of Measure S, which didn't even get 30% of the vote, a couple different ways I think of reading that. One is that the measure itself was poorly written and misguided in certain ways, and there are plenty of people who are anxious about development who couldn't bring themselves to vote for it because they just didn't think it would be an effective instrument for dealing with those issues that they're concerned about. The other way of looking at it is that it's a pretty strong mandate for a different vision of the city. If you think about the fact that Measure S backers moved Measure S from a November election to a March election looking for an older, I think, whiter, more homeowning electorate, and still were defeated so strongly. And to go back to your point about how this is a continual conversation, an electoral conversation, think about Prop U a generation ago, in 1986, passed resoundingly 2-1, and now you're looking at Measure S failing 2-1. What do you take from those results in terms of the voters' vision for how they want to shape the city or see it shaped going forward.
Well, I said this kind of, whether it was going to pass or not at the beginning of S, I felt like it was the kind of last death cough of a past approach to things, which is not to dismiss the concerns that people had. I shared them, and I said that to the writers of Measure S, except for the moratorium, and I've been working on them as mayor. But I think that approach more than a whole, I think that approach is just, is dying in Los Angeles, which is not to say that everybody in every neighborhood wants, downtown LA.
Right.
I think that we won't have that, nor could we build that. The biggest failure that we've had, I think people are recognizing the biggest failure is not so much the buildings themselves, it's the infrastructure around them. What are we doing to build more affordable housing, transportation specifically? And the three kind of C's to me, like what do we have the capacity to do now, especially that we have this money? How will we bring in more context? The schools example that I mentioned. And then be more aware of connectivity, not just the geographic connectivity, but the issue connectivity. Like I was just asked by Metro, they're doing I serve on the Metro board, I'll be the chair again on July 1st for the next fiscal year. They're doing a visioning thing. They're like, what should the mission of Metro be? And in the past it's been to run the buses and then the buses and the trains, right? That's Metro's mission. And I said, Metro should be responsible for two things. It should be the main traffic agency addressing traffic, period, because people don't care about buses and trains so much as they care about traffic, which we all experience, and should be the main planning agency for this county, because there is no other one, right? There's SCAG, which is kind of a 5-county visioning entity and does good visioning work, but they have the power now to affect it, especially with Measure M. We'll be assembling more land. A lot of people said, it's not 15 rail lines, Eric, it's 15 economic development corridors with rail lines running through them. And if you think about it that way, for one of the students that I was talking to is from, from Montebello. And if you talk to some West Siders, they think Montebello is like, Palm Springs. It's so far east from downtown. If you live in Montebello, it's about the same distance as going to Mid-Wilshire or something from downtown. And as we develop, for instance, one line that'll be going from downtown LA to Artesia, it's called the Eco Rapid Transit Line through those working class southeast cities that have never had rail. Very important priority for me. All of a sudden, you could have in Huntington Park and Bell and all these kind of immigrant Latino communities, folks are saying, hey, why don't I move there and work downtown? It's only like a 10-minute rail ride, and if they displace the residents there, that will only compound the problems we have. So to me, I think the biggest failure is, and so to finish the thought, at Metro, we've passed a policy that 35% of all the stuff that gets built in terms of housing in Metro, period, will have to be subsidized affordable housing for low-income individuals. There's nothing as radical as that in the country, and it took a lot because Metro is saying, well, we could get a lot more money out of these properties when we're done with them, return that to our buses and our trains if we just sell it off at market rate. And I said, yes, but then you'll need to build more buses and rail lines. So it's the connectivity piece together with that context and that capacity that to me is what we need to address.
And this is one of the absolutely key issues to me in terms of your second term. You have, if you think about Measure M getting 71% of the vote in November, the defeat of Measure S by essentially the same margin, over 70% no, that's a pretty strong expression from the voters about what kind of city they want to see. And we, unlike most cities, have a significant war chest of funding to think about that. But this relationship between transportation and planning, public space design, thinking about, particularly on the light rail above ground lines, thinking about a kind of linear connection, not just the design of each station, but the kind of connective tissue between them as a kind of linear park. I think the opportunity to absolutely reshape not just how we get around the city, but how the city is designed and what it looks like architecturally, what the civic architecture, kind of civic character of the city is. We have, with over $100 billion, that's a significant amount of money to begin to address those issues. But Metro, in my experience, has never thought about itself as a patron of good design, of urban design, as a planning agency. It's run by transportation engineers for the most part. So what's your sense about how to make that switch? And in the time that I've been here, the people who have been more ambitious about planning at Metro have not always survived politically in that agency. And that can be a tough mandate to have within the agency. So how do you approach that? How do you begin to move Metro toward thinking of themselves as really what they are, which is the most important patron of public architecture, civic design in the region?
So Phil Washington, who's your Metro CEO, and I've talked about this specifically, and I've asked him especially, look, we have to build a lot of capacity at Metro because there's never, this is the largest public infrastructure undertaking for transportation in the nation's history at the local level ×2. Not all 120 billion of that goes towards building things. A lot of it's going to go smartly. The voters, it was funny when we did our focus groups, first we were going to do this as a 30-year, then a 40-year, then a 50-year initiative, and the more we did it, the higher our focus groups were saying more people started voting the longer the tax was, which doesn't happen in my business a lot. And then we just asked, well, what if it never ended? And that got the highest. Because I think people actually understood, even though there's some criticism, this is a forever tax, why you need forever, that like, why don't we have a steady stream for transportation? Like, why should our children have to go through this, or our grandchildren, and pass something else? So they wanted kind of a permanence of this, because it's like, you know, the graph is like this. Your capital costs at the beginning are here, you don't have maintenance, but over time when you finally build everything, your maintenance costs, you see in Washington, D.C., where people have died, in Boston, where people were kicking out the windows of a failed rail car, you know, BART trying to pass a maintenance thing and you know, having a difficult
What had
time
been
passing.
models of civic transportation systems really
Like they
not
fall
looking
apart
that
quickly,
way.
you have to continue to invest. So we talked about, but of the 120 billion, let's say about 35 to 40 will be for the construction of these new lines. And interestingly enough, we're taking a very interesting approach to kind of public-private partnerships, not ownership, to be clear to people, but partnerships. Phil Washington was the first guy, part of the reason I recruited him from Denver to do one of these. He did the connector from downtown Denver to the airport, and they finished it 7 years early and for 75% of the cost, because instead of the agency designing the only way that could be accomplished, they put it out to bid and said, tell us how you would do it. And it's almost like the X Prize. You get all these companies spending their millions on like the best way and their expertise, and they figured out the best way and saved money. So whether it's going to be the private companies that I think do a better job oftentimes on design, whether it is having in-house that capacity for the construction management with an eye towards that, one of the most radical things we did is we've now cooked in that first mile and last mile, which is a term we use for how people actually get that first and last mile to the main rail lines, has to be cooked into the project by anybody who now submits to Metro. Usually what happens is it gets built, and then afterwards we're like, oh, let's find some dollars because nobody can get there, or the parking lot doesn't work, or how are the bikers going to get there, et cetera. This will now have to get cooked in, and it's much smarter and cheaper to cook it into the actual architecture and the flow from the beginning. So there's some pretty radical steps, whether it's on affordable housing or that, which don't quite get to the design, but they will impact the design and the form part of, or the function part of the form. And then the last piece is, I think that it would be good for Metro, but I'm also aware in a county that there's a lot of different ideas of what good design is throughout the county. I mean, it's one thing to try to plan the city. There's some real strong ideas in Whittier that might be different in Santa Clarita, it might be different in Santa Monica. But that said, I feel like, yeah, too often we've gone towards the most boring architecture. And so where I've tried to insert myself, and will continue to while I'm on the Metro board, is like the connectivity to the Broad Museum, for instance, of the downtown connector was just like an ugly bridge. And Eli Broad said, I can't have this connecting to my museum. Can you call Frank Erie and ask him to design a bridge? Well, Frank was busy with a bunch of stuff, but Frank said, here's one of my associates. And for the same price, we got what will be a much more dynamic looking bridge at a place that it should be dynamic and fit the context. So it's another way we're doing it.
And what's your sense about why the...
One person like that.
Clap for that. In fact, we're going to be seeing the first generation with Regional Connector and a couple other lines of the kit of parts station design, a new approach to station architecture at Metro. So it'd be interesting to see how those look and how they work in terms of public space. But ridership has been going down. We're not the only city that's seeing transit ridership going down. In Metro's case, rail ridership is up thanks mostly to Expo. Bus ridership significantly down, so the numbers across the network as a whole are down. What's your sense about what's causing that? And to what extent is car share, Uber, Lyft partially an explanation for that?
I don't know that that's stealing it yet. I think maybe a little bit, but not much. I think it's cheaper gas mostly, and a bad bus riding experience. So we're very focused on, you know, this shouldn't be about building just 15 more rail lines. The $120 billion is about making the bus lines better. The security on them is not very good, so we've just changed. It was exclusively done by Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. We just voted to share that between the Long Beach Police Department, Los Angeles Police Department, and LA Sheriff's Department. So, and we're forcing a lot more people on security personnel onto the buses instead of just hanging out at the rail station where the good Starbucks is or whatever. And I think that we have not looked closely at Mike Bond, and I'm going to appoint when I become chair to a council member who's on the MTA board to a committee he'll chair that will look at the riding experience. Like, why can't we started doing this a couple places, but the bus stops, we have one across from City Hall, where you can charge your devices, where there's free Wi-Fi, where if you have sight impairment, it announces when the next bus is. And another one, we've started putting kids' games. How many times have we seen a parent with a kid? How many times have we been a parent with a kid, and you're there at that bus stop, and it's just exhausting. You know, there's no tic-tac-toe game. There's no, like, simple things that we could do that would enliven the streetscape and also give people something to do. So, and I think the price. You know, we're a very unique public transportation system. We have the highest percentage of low-income people of any major public transportation system in the country. So it's really the transportation of last resort for people of lower income. As that, you know, becomes more interconnected, they will benefit from that, the current riders. And we're not looking, I'm less interested in bringing just a whole new sea of middle-class riders that would somehow displace or take funds away from improving the experience for the lower-income riders. But I think there's a big part of, if you make that experience better for the current riders, more people will come as well. But I don't think it's Uber and Lyft stuff right now.
So you think those bus ridership declines can be reversed?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, when the LA Times wrote that story, if you just took a few years further back, it's actually up. I mean, it's always where you can write your story that it's up, it's down, depending almost any time, but it's less down here than in other cities, but I think that's just cheap gas right now, for the most part. And look, and it's always going to be, there's many people who still don't take public transportation because as slow as it is, it's still faster in your car. Right. And so, you know, the Expo line, that was a criticism, like, you know, it moves so slowly. And a subway will be great. I think the Wilshire subway will absolutely be a game changer. That's going to be, you know, 20 minutes in the midst of no traffic, which will be faster than a car from UCLA to downtown. And we're exploring some really interesting moments. We put money aside for new technology, and I think that the aerial space, you're going to see transportation, human transportation in the civic environment. In the terrestrial space, you'll see it in, you know, the rail lines we're building, but the subterranean space as well. And, you know, I've been spending some time with Elon Musk and his attempts to try to change our boring technology. This become a very boring conversation quickly, but build tunnels much more quickly, you know, which right now move quite slowly. And if we did, he wants to put cars in them, we want to put transit, but we'll figure out, you know, figure out if we can build faster tunnels. I think that too will change the face of things. We need to, I was very worried we'd pass Measure M and have a 40-year plan that 3 years into this people would say, you're building what? Like the whole world isn't going to move that way ever again.
Right, right. You mentioned the LA River. That's another, like transit, it's one of those issues where you have a significant amount of direct control, but some indirect control. It's about 2/3 of it is in the city and the rest outside of the city in LA County. And I think even people who follow the issue, who are interested in the future of the LA River, particularly in connection to open space and some of the issues we've already talked about, have a hard time keeping track of who's responsible for what. It's an incredible collection of agencies at the city, at the county, at the state, and at the federal level. Give us a sense, a kind of snapshot of where things are, particularly in terms of Frank Gehry's involvement, something that I've written about, of course, but where things stand, when the public might begin to see a kind of new vision about what the river might look like, and to what extent you can actually think about designing that from the mayor's office when there's so many other agencies.
Well, I've come to surrender to the fact that most of LA River work is like planting trees. Like, you probably aren't going to be the main person who benefits from the shade. So we will open the new state park this month or later next month, I think. Thank you. 22nd April. Tom LeBons, ladies and gentlemen, great council member, Mr. LA. Tom LeBons is here. 22nd of April.
I'm working on a piece on it right now. So
which, you know, when I was at Oxy as a professor, to date myself, it was like the big fight when Mayor Reardon wanted to put a bunch of warehouses, right, at the time. A bunch of folks like Louis McAdams, friends of the Los Angeles River founder who just retired, and great man, absolutely. My former creative writing teacher in high school who turned me onto the river. You know, they fought for, and now, what is it, you know, 17, 16 years later, it'll open. Similarly, we just purchased and announced the G2 parcel, which is what's keeping us in Cypress Park from getting to the river. We have an amazing state park there too, but the railroad tracks cut us off, and we finally bought it. It's not cheap. The cleanup won't be cheap, but it's like each mayor, each council, each generation needs to like just pile onto the piece that they can get. Measure M, we put the river into it. We can finally finish a contiguous bike path from all the way up in Chatsworth down to Long Beach, 51 miles. And then there's the kind of more visionary pieces. So what Frank is doing, and potentially what we could do with the new Union Station. I want to kind of throw this out there tonight. The Union Station to the river, where Los Angeles City owns some of the land. Something called Piper Tech is right there, a building that we have all sorts of things in. It's right by the Twin Towers, the jails. But if we're redoing and high-speed rail is offering us some money to help reconfigure and think about Union Station, which will be in a more and more important hub for all sorts of things from Metrolink to our connections to the airport. One of the things we're looking at, for instance, under Measure M as a visionary project is could we do an underground or at grade nonstop connection from the airport to Union Station. We'll connect that, with Crenshaw line, but that'll be a slow local.
Right.
So Frank has 3 projects he has met with me about. They require a lot of private and public land. I don't want to say where all them are because it shoots land prices up. But let's say one's kind of downtown, one's kind of where there's a lot of dead people and near the river, and there's another one as well that I'll just keep that. But he has some really incredible plans, and he's donated millions of dollars of technology and time to mapping the river and thinking about the river. And I think he recognizes, and I do too, that this will be a combination of state and local partners, of federal money that will come in for the ecology part now that I've fought for and we got the feds, but who knows in this Congress what will get allocated, but it's still passed that the feds will restore the ecology of the river in the heart of it towards downtown, the Glendale Narrows. Like, it's I don't know how to describe it. It's like, you ever see one of those houses in LA that like, oh, this was the original room, it was a one-room house, and then suddenly it just kind of grew. Maybe that's the wrong metaphor because those houses can be ugly, but the river will be a parceling together, literally, of land, of visions, and I don't ever think we'll ever central plan it. I mean, there's 15 cities along, like Robert Garcia, who will be here, and is a dear friend, will be doing some amazing stuff down Long Beach, and I've fought for the southern part of the river, even though it's outside of my city as much as the northern stretch, because we have to have that interconnectivity. The other thing, like, Tom LaBonge did something when he and I served on the river committee, which was just to get the signs up that have the egret. It was a heron or an egret that's on it? It's a heron, right? Gray heron. And just to have a visual cue and to have that go from the headwaters up in Chatsworth down to Long Beach, and some architectural elements of the lights on the bikeway and the parks that will be in multiple cities. If we can connect that, I think people can understand this complicated river, because every metaphor has been the wrong one. The High Line, it's not the High Line, it's 1,000 times bigger than the High Line, and it's not elevated, and it's not in the middle of Manhattan. It's just a different place. Yeah, it's everybody points to the thing they like in some park and say, do that with the LA River. The LA River is a city unto itself.
Right, absolutely.
And a quarter of the city lives within walking distance of it. So.
And like Metro, I mean, you can think about it in terms, there's so many ways you can use it as a way to read the future of Los Angeles, as I've talked to my students about it. And certainly it's about ecology, it's about our relationship with nature, it's about our policy about stormwater and all of that, but it's also about open space. It's about opening up in a city that's really park poor. That to me is the greatest potential,
Absolutely.
maybe single potential as to, great.
Think
about it as a linear park that is at that amazing scale. It absolutely dwarfs the High Line. It dwarfs these other projects, which makes it probably more daunting in some ways, but also makes the potential all the greater.
One last thing on that,
sure.
too, just 2 seconds, is there is some talk down the line of maybe establishing an authority, a state authority that could transcend the cities. Now, whenever you suggest one thing, there's a conspiracy theory behind it that people don't like, but I think a lot of people really like the idea of an authority, because today it's between the feds, between the state, between the county, between the different cities. There is some coherence to that idea that I actually like.
Right, interesting to follow that. So questions about the new administration, President Trump. I'm curious, in terms of, I want to ask about your interactions, the interactions you've had so far, but I want to connect that to what we've been talking about. These big ticket items, the future of the river, transit expansion, these pieces that, we're not, unlike some cities, we don't have to rely entirely on federal support to get our transit expansion done, but certainly a White House can frustrate some of those ambitions. So what kinds of interaction have you had with the president? What's your sense about what that relationship will be like in terms of support or some obstacles in terms of realizing those larger pieces of the vision.
Well, this has been my political advice, but it also to all my friends, but it's also my policy advice, is never fixate just on the president. And I don't care if it's President Obama that's in there or President Trump. It's key members of Congress have always been as or more, even more important. A budget, we all, as we should have, flipped out about the proposed budget that President Trump has huge cuts in environmental, anti-poverty, transportation, all sorts of programs that we need depend on, and it's our tax dollars, by the way, and then a military budget that expanded by $54 billion. But those who've ever been around Washington, presidential budgets are very different than mayoral budgets, where we work very closely with, and the council maybe changes 1 or 2% of my budget when I give it to them. It's more of a suggestion. They go, thank you very much, Mr. President, for your budget. Now we're writing our congressional one. And so those relationships, for instance, during the Obama years, when there was Republican control of the House and Senate, were really important. Chairman Schuster, Bill Schuster, is a Republican from Pennsylvania, is kind of a can-do, pro-infrastructure, moderate Republican who has come out here many times. He's toured the port, he's flown over the LA River and is a fan of it. Senator Inhofe and I sat down. Now this is, Senator took a snowball to the floor of the Senate to say global warming doesn't exist because there was snow outside. He and I vehemently disagree about that interpretation. But he said I'm the most conservative member of the Senate as ranked by the American Conservative Union, but he was also pointing out to me that he had folks who are Tea Partiers who don't want to get anything done, and he reads the Constitution. It says we should invest in infrastructure, and so we work together to get some of that transportation funding. So my responsibility is to produce for all of you. Not, there are other people who, we all play different roles, and I think this city, I'm very proud, and I've been there alongside, has not just resisted, but stood up for our values, whether it's at the airport for refugees, whether it's yesterday's day of action of immigration that I dreamed up with a few mayors, and we had 65 cities in 31 states all acting together to stand up for our immigrants, whether it's on the environment, the list could go on. But I also am not going to stop talking to any administration, because why, if you disagree with somebody politically, why yell at them and then say, please take my money too? It's like giving them a double victory, and it's disempowering ourselves. And so on the White House side, we've had some very fruitful conversations with Gary Cohn, who is the chief economic advisor to the president, happens to be a Democrat, is head of the National Economic Council, who's charged by the president on this infrastructure thing. And that was music to my ears. I mean, infrastructure, $1 trillion. All right, let's hold them to it and see if we can do it. And Democrats in Congress are more into that than the Republicans in Congress, so maybe we can figure out a coalition here. And so I brought together 6 mayors from 2 days before the inauguration to sit down with Gary, a couple Republicans, about 4 of us that were Democrats, who'd all passed infrastructure initiatives in our cities, Oklahoma City, Los Angeles, Seattle, other places, to say, look, if you want to do infrastructure, here's the best kind of partnership we could have, where feds step up with some, we step up, and you tell cities you're going to have to step up. That would reward a city like LA. It has rewarded us. I've brought about $4 billion back from Washington to accelerate those rail lines since I've been mayor. But I think it's just the reality. When the old days where you went to Washington with an empty hat, said fill it to the top, and they would build you a transit line. Those days are gone, but if you come with a half-filled hat, they will top it off. And I want to keep that going. So it's kind of like, don't sacrifice anything in your values, and I never will, on those things that who we are, on immigration, on environment, on all the progress, and embody that. And don't feel disempowered, because most of the power in those things actually exists where we live every day. Don't cede the power you have. Don't just whinge that everything's being taken away. That's a weak position. I want us to actually stand up and say we're going to as long as I'm mayor, our police officers will never be immigration agents, and that's just full stop, because it's morally the right thing to do, but it's also practically the right thing to do, because it started with Daryl Gates. He wasn't exactly a progressive police chief, but he knew you need to have trust from your immigrant communities to police correctly. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's kind of the dynamic. And some people said, oh, that must be a narrow tightrope. And I said, no, it's kind of the way, as mayor and as a council member, it's the way I've always approached things. It's no different. It might be a little bit more depressing to read the news. I might be more offended by things I read. But I'm no less determined to get resources here and to build things and to do things. I don't want to look back and say, I took a stand, but my city fell apart flip of that, I'm not going to say, oh, I sacrificed my values to get money. Our values are not for sale. But I think between that, there's actually the area where we operate.
And to go back to the infrastructure piece, in the most optimistic version of that, this is a more optimistic spin that I've heard from most people about the potential, particularly in terms of public-private partnership. What could that look like for Los Angeles? What are the projects that you might, assuming it actually comes together?
Well, let's think about it practically. There's no way you're going to get to $1 trillion, which is the president's goal, without counting, for instance, $120 billion of Measure M money here in LA. I mean, think about it. That's 12% of that goal.
Right.
But if you wanted to wait out for 40 years, you can't claim credit for some of that. But if you help us accelerate, like in Whittier, anybody here from Whittier? All right. So Whittier, the extension of the Gold Line, what's your name? Your first name? Matthew. So Matthew, I'm sure, and his family will want to get that Gold Line extension out there. In a year or two, the environmental work will be done for the extension of the Gold Line. But Matthew, how old are you now, Matthew, if you don't mind me asking? 30. So Matthew's 30 today. Let me do the math real quick. He will be 55 when it starts construction. Under the schedule, because look, all sales tax doesn't all come in at once, so somebody's at the end of the list. It happened to be based on all sorts of metrics and choices people made, that the Whittier line, I think, starts construction in 2042. But the environmental work, to repeat that, will be done in a couple of years. It's actually ready to build. So if we know sales tax is coming in, we know it'll be much more expensive in 2042 if construction inflation usually outpaces regular inflation. Can't we get a financial institution or a national infrastructure bank, which Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has talked about, to front load us that money now and guarantee a payback? If people today had an investment vehicle and said, hey, to the private marketplace, we'll give you a 4% return, we'd be falling all over ourselves because we can't get 1% at the banks. Lock that in while money's cheap and build that, by the time you're, say, 45. I'm not guaranteeing it to you next year, but that seems to be, it's not being overly optimistic. I think they have right now, the administration, I think, over anticipates how much they can leverage from the private sector. I think they've talked about putting 160 million in and suddenly it would become $1 trillion.
Right.
I would caution them that you actually need to put skin in the game that is grants. The Democrat side is all like, oh, you want to do $1 trillion? They put something that has probably no chance of passing, but I absolutely support of $1 trillion of just grants, that are competitive grants for these areas of the loans that we are very good at getting and grants for our subway and rail lines. I think you're going to have to continue some of that in order to get an agreement. And we as Democrats have to be open to the idea of leveraging. It's not actually an ideological issue, it's a pacing issue. And it's not a dirty thing to go to banks to front load that money. It's actually a smart thing. I will save you money, produce more, and do it more quickly.
Mm-hmm. We need to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but last question. The piece that I wrote about looking ahead of your second term, the part of that piece that got the most feedback, the most reaction was something I wrote about not the design of public spaces and public buildings, which we've already talked about, but asking developers to think about the design of the kind of typical project. And I think there's so much attention on the lightning rod projects in Hollywood and elsewhere, the Rick Caruso projects that get so much attention, so much ink. But all of us have had the experience over the last decade of seeing the kind of basic boulevards of Los Angeles change in a really dramatic way, filled with these apartment buildings that are kind of designed within an inch of their lives that have not been left a kind of legacy of good design. So the question is, on the private side, where you don't have as much direct control, what can we ask of developers? How can we make that sort of average, typical project that we're building so many of? I mean, cities around the country built, during the boom years, built all kinds of sort of iconic projects. We built thousands and thousands of the kind of new dingbat apartments, which don't have the charm of the old dingbats.
I miss the old dingbats.
I do too. But some of that is structural. I mean, it's developers building the tallest wood frame building they can before a requirement of steel or concrete kicks in, and packing as many units as they can. So the question is, how do we make that sort of typical average building a better piece of design, given the impact it has on all of us?
Well, I think there's a role for all of us. There's a role for those of us who are community leaders, neighborhood council leaders, who serve on our land use committees, people who turn out for a public hearing, to be voices for good design in terms of the look and the architecture and the finish, but also the envelope of these things. Mm-hmm. It was really instructive to me as mayor and, as council member in the 13th district where I was serving, That the only time that I had a project that I didn't want to build, and the community, traditionally a little bit less pro-development, at least from the loudest voices, community in the hills of Hollywood, were like, you have to build this, you have to say yes, we want this, to a project that is across from the Pantages Theater. It was Boulevard 6200, now it's called East Yard, or East, not East Yard, East something. East Town, thank you. Tom LeBon's coming through again. It actually, the design in the end, the finish was nice, but the scale, where people were saying, it's going to block our view if you go higher. I wanted it to be a much more, same number of units, so the exact same number of units, but I wanted it to be on a smaller footprint and go higher. And people say, that'll block our view of the Hollywood sign. And today I tell people, go walk on Hollywood Boulevard, on the north side, just east of the Pantages, and see if you can see the Hollywood sign. Because it is one of those fortresses of what we do here, 5 stories that block your 100% view.
Yeah.
You can't see a thing. Maybe there would have been 1 home or 2 homes that would miss their particular angle of the Hollywood sign if we were high, but it would have preserved actual light corridors and views. And so part of it is really not, same thing happened with the Millennium Project, which did try to go quite high, but if they had done the whole thing and smashed it down, I bet it wouldn't have had a lot of opposition, or as much opposition, because somehow we think that if we hide it in this messy, mushy block, it's not going to have the same impact. If you're going to oppose it because of the number of cars, oppose it no matter what the shape, and say if you have to do it, go narrower and taller. I think we can have more design element at the city level. We now have a design studio, but when I was a council member, we had a group of volunteer architects too, who are part of kind of a design review committee. And that can be contentious for those of you who are architects. You get, it's like, I always make the joke, get 4 Jews in a room and you'll have 7 political parties. You get 4 architects in a room, you'll have 15 opinions. But a couple Jews laughed at that, but it's necessary to get that sort of ferment. And I think we can also have, and something in the second term I'd consider, and I've talked to Vince about it, like maybe a chief design officer. I mean, our planning director is that, but doesn't have the day-to-day time to do that. And you have to be careful, because you don't want somebody who comes in who's chief design officer and like, I just love Spanish Revival. I mean, you have to have somebody who's flexible enough to understand that design will be different in different places, but bring good elements of green space, of connectivity, of transportation connections, of ecological design, of water retention, of all those things. I think LA is ready for that, and I think that could be one of the kind of good legacies of a second term for me.
And part of that is parking requirements too. We're one of the few cities that still has parking minimums instead of maximums in terms of big cities. Do you see your second term being a time when that turns around, given that demand for parking is likely to drastically go down over the next generation?
Funny you should say that. Recode LA, I mean, part of it is looking at downtown and maybe suggesting some places where there's no minimum. Downtown's very interesting. You could do a lot of interesting things in downtown, or parts of downtown, and it's not all the same place. But one study of somebody had 41% of downtown is built for parking cars, and cars, like the average car, is motionless 96% of the time. 3% of the fuel actually turns the wheels, and at peak traffic, our city streets, which is only about 10% of the day, are about 6% filled. So it's a highly inefficient way. Think of how much open space we could open up. And why are we requiring a restaurant downtown next to the other restaurant, next to the other restaurant, to each have parking for 30, 40 people when most people are walking or getting dropped off or using transit there? It's not pleasant to bring your car today, so why not just go full in? So I wouldn't do that in Porter Ranch, where there's not a single parking meter and no, in Council District 12, Councilmember Mitch Englander's district, there's not a single parking meter and there's no valet parking at all, to give you an idea of the density of that area. Okay, so parking spaces are probably needed when you open things up there, because people are taking their car, and it's not such a bad experience. Those of us who grew up in LA, if you still have the space for it, it's convenient. There's a reason we all went to cars.
Versus downtown or Koreatown.
But downtown, Koreatown, other places, I think that scale, and we have to be bold, and even consider things like, why do we have so many parking lots that are still there? Is a reverse tax on them something to consider, where if you have 10 stories that you could build there, and you're only using 1 story because it's a parking lot, tax the other 9, and that'll get built. In a housing crisis, shouldn't we be building as much as we can where there's not controversy and where we can put those units? And as long as I'm talking about housing, just because I know we're at the end, please call your council members and help push for a linkage fee, which is something which would require people building market rate units to put money aside to help us, as they do for schools and parks, build up our affordable housing trust fund to build subsidized housing for lower income Angelenos, because that can really help us preserve existing housing and not displace people by building new affordable housing. It passed our City Planning Commission. It's going to come to the City Council in the next month or two. We've got great support. I think there's close to a majority of the council, but maybe your call could help kick a council member or two over the edge. So that's my pitch. Come back to see the two mayors next week, but also call for a linkage fee in the city of Los Angeles.
Perfect segue to next week. Thank you for that plug. I hope we will see some of you next week. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you all so much.
And let's thank the mayor. It's terrific to be able to continue this conversation and have this kind of dialogue in public. So please join me in thanking the mayor.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. That's great.